we're in this moment where, on a collective level, it's very clear that the consequences of an extractive culture, a separatist culture where we understand ourselves to be separate from nature, from other species, from one another, has come to the point where we're seeing the real consequences of it. And maybe also on a personal level, people are really feeling the suffering that's implicit in disconnection, in losing contact with ancestors, with the more than human world, with our kins of other species, and with ourselves. And therefore, I think, or along with that, we're seeing this turn to indigenous sources of wisdom, or return, or rerouting. And that's a question that many people have alive for themselves, understanding that indigenous ways of being have an alternative to the dominant paradigm that we're living under. And many people also at the same time find Buddhist teachings on interdependence to be very compelling in that regard. And you're one of the few people I know who are bringing together both Dharma wisdom and indigenous wisdom from two different traditions and braiding them together along with your psychotherapy background, your psychology background. And I want to start by just asking you, what was your process of re-indigenizing like, and what is the value of undergoing that process?
That's a really good question. And I would have to say that I didn't intentionally seek out to re-indigenize myself. When I, came to this path of the Buddha Dharma, it was really about, actually what led me there was just fulfilling an emptiness inside myself, not relating to my life or others around me or just kind of what I would, hindsight 2020 call I had an existential crisis. Very young at 19. Like, this is life. This is it. Who are we? Why are we here? Just to work, to love, to, what does this mean? And that's what brought me to the importance of an important stranger that brought me to the Buddha Dharma and brought me to Thailand. And was to address that first and foremost, like what's happening here. I felt really like someone kicked me in the gut, awakening to what's this life about? Who am I? So it was a real interpersonal entry, I would say. And as I was in the monastery, just experiencing, there was the language barrier, but just experiencing, like literally the nuns that took me in were just like, watch, do, and be, and quiet. That was that was the universal language. So I basically went back to being a toddler and just, taking things in as a sponge and, mimicking what they're doing. I'm sitting and chanting. I'm not knowing what I'm doing, chanting or, what I'm sitting. There was that language barrier. But after time, and then with the work, my, cutting carrots and vegetables and such, my work that I did, that was part of it. Just living in a monastery, just doing as they're doing. And it was surrounded by a jungle and it was beautiful. And so it was really, things started arising by that development of stillness and being, chanting and meditating, not really having an understanding of it, but also quieting myself and being more still and being in nature and in a monastery with others. So it was kind of what I would consider a fast track to personal development because it brought up so much stuff that I didn't see arise. And what that meant is like, all of the flooding of family childhood things arise. And, you know, having come from a background of a father who's an alcoholic, a mother, you know, a domestic violence household, it's at best was unpredictable, you know, as a child. So, you know, a lot came up, a lot of emotions such as anger. So that's how I met the Dharma, you know, like just suddenly, you know, it was the interpersonal development of really touching into those emotions I hadn't touched into or remembered even, like, you know, by quieting, I was remembering scenarios and very scary. Um, and so, you know, so I just say that that was the first and foremost is the personal development and inquiry. And then coming into that and then later, the head nun brought in uh, English speaking teachers. And I had my first discourse of a 10-day retreat and learning about the life of the Buddha and the Four Noble Truths. And so that was really important instruction that I never left because it really was able for me to experience being with all of that that was true, but being who I was in that moment, which I'm no longer that child in that household, you know. And so I had to meet myself. There was a reckoning at that age. Who is this person, this young person? So there was a lot of healing. I would say it was Dharma medicine. The Buddha was the physician. I received the medicine, and it was held by a collective of people in the monastery. So as I was experiencing that, I also felt like I was missing home, like missing my experience as a child with being left with my grandmother on my father's side and her mother. So I got the great fortune of being with my great grandmother and my father's mother some weekends and experiencing being in her house as she cooks and people come by and you know the kitchen was where all the action happened and you know it was celebrating arguing crying yelling like you name it everyone came through and all this and as a child it was so exciting just to witness that so just really you know that remembering of the women in my family and feeling that in the environment that I was in the monastery. So I was feeling a connection of some sort that was very soothing. So it awakened this part of like, who am I? Like even deeper investigating that my father's side is indigenous and some is unknown indigenous. Like I don't know my grandfather very much. And then my mother's side is more Spanish, Basque, and you know, and they didn't really get along at all. They didn't approve of either family. So coming, you know, so that re-indigenizing didn't happen till much later, but the investigation of who I was started right away because it was hard to deny once you start practicing. You know, who am I? What's here? And then, so it was a long journey of interpersonal development to come through that. And I kind of look at indigenizing as a way of like really centering the indigenous aspect of myself. And so that means I have to decenter, decolonize the colonized framework that I was, you know, brought up in. And I was, you know, brought up in the South of America in Texas. So once I left my house, language was at home. I was the generation that did not get taught the language of my ancestors. I heard the language in my grandmother's house, or you know, my grandparents, but I did not grow up with it. So I was assimilating and come to know later in life when I started asking those questions, like why did we not learn language, was more about assimilation. And then reviewing the path of understanding coming from a culture of being what I call deep patterns of invisibility. And really, from my grandmother to my mother to every auntie, like whatever I do, go to school, don't say anything, don't ask questions, basically just be invisible. And so that was interesting. That came later on as a young adult, understanding like, wow, what's this about? These pattern, a cultural pattern of a whole people being invisible. And I would say it would be both sides of my family, ironically, a cultural pattern of invisibility for survival, for safety, for protection. Um, and that brought up like, what is this name? Why didn't I get one of my grandmother's names or like, some of my ancestors' cool name? Like, who's Carol? Who do we have an ancestor Carol? This is like I'm Generation X. So like, I'm like, Carol's like some 1950s, Midwest name of some woman who's a teacher or something. So I was like, why is my name Carol? But okay, my mother called me Carolina, so of course it's different in Spanish. But I was just like, I couldn't relate to this name, to those parts of myself. So it was just really understanding that, and then understanding, very early on, experiencing othering in both sides of the family, not belonging anywhere in particular. And then, the complexity of all that. So re-indigenizing for me was really starting to embrace my ancestral healing and ancestral medicine of who I am. And even making, I would say, peace, around the unknown ancestors. It's kind of unsettling to not know all of your ancestors, you know. And so it's an ongoing process. When I teach currently, I would point the way for people to start investigating, their ancestors, who are their ancestors. And it takes, not everyone has direct access to ancestors or understanding who their relatives are or where they're from, or there's so much that comes up. And there's also a lot of shame that comes up, a lot of, um, I think most Americans, I don't know, maybe this is an opinion or an assumption, can we name three generations of ancestors? So I think, for me, the re-indigenizing is really coming into the bones of who I am, and understanding from that point is like, who's my ancestors, and what were they about, and who am I? That kind of investigation. So yeah, it's and I think that also what I feel is very important is no longer centering the colonizers' perspective, like decentering colonization and understanding that I was very assimilated, and I had to decondition myself from the assimilation process that started very young in order to even accept the parts of me I didn't know about, to accept, what all that was in terms of what was inherited from generation to generation just to be in this country. And what I tell people, the good, the bad, the ugly aspect of our family and ourselves, and to reckon with that, because that's what the Dharma holds, for us to be able to turn towards ourselves and see this. And we may have all kinds of stuff before we can just even be with it in a way that has metta or compassion.
For other people who might be in a similar existential crisis, or maybe a much softer form of wanting to understand and be able to fully accept and know and draw on the fullness of who they are. Can you say a little bit about what you've gained or what is to be gained from this re-indigenizing process and decolonizing process? What's at stake?
Yeah, I feel that what's at stake is really losing and this aspect of understanding who we are, culturally speaking, and I feel that that's important. That the ancestors that we are with, that we are part of, that are with us in the bones of who we are, that very much touch on from an indigenous point of view. That's something that indigenous people knew a long time ago, that the ancestors are in the bones of who we are. So that's knowledge that's not tapped in. So that's at stake. They've been here before, they've been here. We can say that what's happening in the world right now, many of our ancestors have seen this and been through this. And so there's really deep medicine and that can come through for understanding the relationship with the ancestors. Um, and what also is at stake is that cultivation and rootedness to the authentic expression of who you are. I know, and it's not just on a personal development, but on an ancestral understanding of who are you. And there are many indigenous elders I've met, and even other incredible people like James Baldwin, like incredible people who say, when someone comes to us and that's doesn't know who they are, so much can happen. So I'll just speak for being American in this country. When our white identified people who come here and colonized America, because indigenous people were here by the millions, and they discovered America, which there was nothing to discover. We were here already. And so they left Europe and to seek a better place. So they come here and whatever. We all know the story, what happened. And so the colonization that occurred was, it developed this culture of whiteness, which white bodied or white identified is not a culture. And so, how do we decenter whiteness, decenter colonization? We do that by really reckoning, like, who are your ancestors? Where do you come from? What land do you come from? What stories? What have your people gone through? So there's a deep connection to understanding who we are. So when we come in the presence of an indigenous person and we may be European descendant, we are understanding who we are, where we come from. In fact, my European friends have still lived in their family home that's been in their generation for generations. So there's a deep rootedness meeting someone who knows who they are, from an ancestral point of view. And so that right immediately, there's a moment of we see each other, right? Because we come with something. But if you don't know who you are, and it's easy for a culture to take what they don't know. And then it becomes something they incorporate as their own. And so I feel like that's what's at jeopardy. Right? I feel like the more we know our cultural roots and who we are, then we can start to heal ourselves in terms of, maybe the family systems. We inherit different patterns and limited behaviors that were passed down generationally, that's still being passed down. So part of the ancestral medicine and ancestral work is not only acknowledging who we are, but also the healing component of understanding that there's also inheriting different patterns that we may not, patterns of addiction, patterns of abuse. We can go back and see who else was the abuser, who else was addicted to alcohol. Like there's a pattern, and when do we stop? And I think that the knowing of like, oh, there's a family pattern here, then we can really start to heal deeper for the next generation. It's not just our own healing; it's also for the next generation. So, and I think one example I give, like later when I was doing, because the ancestral work could take however long it takes. It's not something that is just check off and we're done. It's a process. And one of the process that I've had like not too long ago is discovering that both sides of my family had sibling rivalry. That's really interesting. And I was discovering that as I was experiencing that with my own sibling, that there was a discord, a fight with my own siblings. Like, what's happening here? And so, and then just really feeling like, you know, one of my siblings put us on timeout, what I call put us on timeout. We were excommunicated. And I have just left like, what is really happening here? Wow, that's really extreme. And so I was really feeling into that in my practice and really sending healing for my family, my brothers, and then as I was investigating even more of my family, that the family rivalry, the sibling rivalry existed in both sides of the family. That there was a pattern of sibling, a rift occurring, like a break between the sibling. And I don't know about you, as soon as I found out, that's for the next generation of children in my family lineage, I do not want that for them. So I was like, this needs to be repaired now. And so, how do I repair this ancestral pain, this ancestral truth, this ancestral that's getting handed down now to the next generation? So, you know, luckily, the addiction part was addressed. And, you know, from my father as an alcohol, and then my brothers started going through that process, and we had a family intervention around one of my brothers. So it's like, you know, so it got deeper. Like it got really like there was blame for the new generation, blaming the past generation of why they're doing what they're doing in regards of addiction, that they're an addict because of them, you know, like because they were not addressing that they were addicted, you know, dependent on alcohol. So, so this is the connection of why the family, the healing that needs, the broken links that we have in our family that need to be healed. That's just one taste of like why, how can, you know, working with and embracing culturally who I am and understanding my ancestors can help the healing process of me coming in, one, breaking patterns and belief systems that may no longer be things that I want to carry, but at the same time, that get in my way of coming into my authenticity, in the way of me having a peaceful life, in a way that, you know, that I'm not free. And many people just think that it's them, but if you look close enough, it's not. That there's the, you know, looking in one's own family system and culture, what are the cultural norms as well, and understanding that. And then, you know, honestly, with the cultural norms, also bringing in the new generation and once being a young teenager, those cultural norms may not be my norms. You know, like cultural traditions may not might be traditions I am interested in following. And so really understanding this next generation that's here, that there's some things that they don't want to take on from the culture, that, you know, they aren't really necessarily doing that. And so I think that that's really important as well as there's a deep healing and also a coming into oneself. Yeah.
When you're talking about culture and family patterns and all the conditioning that we're subjected to, and that then turns up in our patterns of behavior, and this sense that we might have that we're being driven by some sort of repeated patterns that we don't necessarily see where they came from. In Buddhist terms, that's often explored through the concept of karma. Is that something that you work with or could apply to what you're describing?
You know, I would say yes, no. I personally do, work with that because of causes and condition, actions, but that's a whole Buddhist cosmetology that, that's not everyone subscribes to. So I actually, but on a personal level, yes, I do subscribe to it. And I do feel that, it's just like, in terms of karma, like that my actions do have an impact or consequences. And, so with the mindfulness or the Buddha Dharma, it allows me not, a prescription, just to be with what is true. And then to actually then, understand that the mind is coming, perceptions are arising, understanding, the what we call the four foundations of mindfulness, like how we work through stuff before it becomes action, or before it becomes an identity, or before it becomes a deep rooted pattern that we live out that could cause harm, because we're in the path of the least amount of harm, the path, so and for me, ethics play a big role in that. Really the practice of ethics and sila are fundamental. It's not just the practice of meditation or the Four Noble Truths without sila or ethics. So ethics play a huge role on, do I burn off this karma in this lifetime or not, or repeat the same patterns?
How might the Dharma, either teachings or practice, serve as a resource for people who are in this process of recovering an awareness of who they are and a rootedness of that in history, in time, in ancestry?
Yeah, that's a good question. My experience for myself and being a lay teacher of the Dharma is people come because of that first noble truth, that they're pointing to, that, whatever distress that we're in, or, somewhat suffering or grief or whatever it is, that first noble truth that many of us have gone through the Dharma door, and brought us here to be with that. And so I feel that that's really important, to that recognizing that first, like what did bring us there. It could be the loss of a relationship or the loss of self. And suddenly you wake up to this life that you're like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Like, who am, what am I doing with this? Why am I in this relationship? Why am I in this job? Like people do wake up painfully to the reality that they created a life that they don't want to live, and they feel stuck in it. And so I feel that, whatever brings you to the Dharma can help with that first. And I feel that, one thing that I point to is for myself is that the ancestral work, or the coming into who are we, it's a support. The relationship with the ancestors is a support system. It's for me, there's a comforting that I know my ancestors have been here before. So there's a resiliency that lives through my body, or I wouldn't be here. And I think it's really important, because I remember once just I was holding a men's group, a Native American men's group of men coming out of San Quentin and re-entering their life in the city. And it's a big jarring experience, and not having anyone. And how are they going? And the biggest fear is that they're going to end up going back, because, it's a huge thing. And yet it's great. They celebrate it. So when I was working in the Native American Health Center, I held a men's group that's really about integrating back into the community and into this life outside of prison. And I remember when we were at the end of, we do a prayer in the beginning and the opening, but at the very end, we also close with a prayer. And I remember very distinctively, like what was coming through me was just like this acknowledgement. And I was in this circle of men, and just acknowledging that 7 generations ago, our ancestors prayed that we would still continue to live. And if we think of the history of 7 generations ago in America, that was a big aspiration for our ancestors because that wasn't being seen. We'd be annihilated. So I think there was something really profound that moved through all of us, like just that feeling of just that stance of standing in circle and feeling being prayed for 7 generations ago through circumstances that were unbelievable, that we're seeing now, of genocide of a whole peoples in different parts of the world. And so there's something that touches that, oh, I can do this. I have resiliency. They made it. We're still here. Like, feel the empowerment of that. And I think for me, the re-indigenization and the memory and the reclamation, reclaiming the indigenous self is really understanding that. And within that is a support. It's a lifeline for me. Like, a support that, oh, I can get through this day. I can get through what's here, which also seems unbelievable. And when I say that, we're in America with this next administration, everything they're doing. I mean, people, the Navajo Nation, they're trying to deport them. Where are they going to deport them to? They've been in this land for thousands of years, their ancestors. Where are they being deported? So it's not working, thank goodness, because there's advocates. But I think that we need the strength of understanding who we are, where we come from. And I would go to say that, when we don't understand that it's really bypassing, that you can meditate all you want, go into meditation retreats for months at a time. You can even hit jhana states. You can even hit thinking that you're at a door close to nirvana and you won't return. Whatever. You can think whatever it is you want. But if you haven't reckoned with your culture of who you are, to me, that's just a bypass. So are you really going to be a non-returner if you haven't really tapped into the sincerity of who you are ancestrally or culturally? And then understand that if you're a white male in this time, your impact or actions towards others. I think that's really powerful. If you come from a people who've created dominance over a whole other people, and you go and meditate and you reach these states, are you a tourist or are you sincerely hitting enlightenment because you've been through the pain of what your ancestors have done to others? And you can touch that because you feel that in yourself, what that pain is. For whatever personal reason is happening to you, you can feel the sorrow and the grief of that for yourself. So for me, the ancestral medicine is so important, of not just acknowledging and going through it, understanding of one's culture, and that it may take a little bit longer for others because they don't have access. So I worked with people who are adopted. So, and still it's a process, but there is a reclamation. And as we are reclaiming these parts of ourselves, these broken pieces of ourselves and putting together, then we can then be liberated from it. Truly liberated, truly not identify. But I've been with plenty of, I will do right speech, but plenty of teachers that come from European descent who really, honestly, it's their languaging of how they're giving instructions is harming people in the room. And yet they're unaware of it. And for me, I just look at it as like, if they understood their cultural history, the language would have changed. And we wouldn't be where we are today because there's lots of unrest of what happens with power and teachers in power.
We've been exploring the personal implications of not doing this work of honoring our ancestry, reckoning with our ancestry, connecting with it, getting to know ourselves. And there's also a huge collective consequence of continuing in the the worldview in which the dominant view is the right one, and the the labeling or the shadowing of indigenous peoples and worldviews as somehow secondary or inferior has this collective consequence of devaluing a source of knowledge, an understanding of right relationships, a recognition that the world is not made for human beings, and human beings are not the only beings with spirit or the only beings with intelligence. And I'm working recently with the idea of animism, which I define as a worldview in which we recognize that human beings are not the only beings whose intelligence is recognized, and in which relationship to non-human beings as persons in their own right is honored. And I wonder, where do you see animism showing up in Buddhist teachings or Buddhist practice? Do you see that relatedness or that recognizing of non-human beings as intelligent or persons or sacred?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And okay, so there the lineage, out of the three schools, I'm coming from the lineage of Theravada, which is a conservative lineage. And but yet my experience being so young was in a forest, in a jungle in Thailand. And okay, the Buddha teaches Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, the aspiration to enlighten towards enlightenment. Doesn't necessarily touch on that so much. And at the same time, when you look at cultures, especially my teachers and their teachers, it's very much rooted in the culture. So my experience that the culture was never left out of the monastery in Thailand. And so there was burning of incense, there was a spirit house, there was there was sacred trees, a spirit house is a shrine. They bring food to their spirits. I mean, so in a sense, the Buddha didn't directly talk about it, but maybe had some, did, so I honestly, I haven't deep dived this conversation, but when I think of it, he did put his hand to have the earth witness his enlightenment. Why would he do that if he did not believe the spirit of the earth as a living being? But he does emphasize interdependence and interconnectedness of all things. So, in respect to all things, through compassion and metta. So, in that acknowledgement, you can argue, and it would be a great argument and I would love a day long with a lot of monastics there to do this, conservative and non-conservative, and talk about this, because it would be fabulous, because he did touch on it in that way. And so some would say, in my view, well, that's kind of touching on it, but and that's where the connection with indigenous technology and knowledge and wisdom really rely on, because all my relations, all things have spirit, all things are respected. And there's no separation from the elements to the elements that meaning air, wind, air, water, fire, earth, those elements that are in the first foundation of mindfulness. It's also within us that makes this body. There's no we're not separate. It's also in the tree. It's also in everything. These elements exist in everything. And so could we say that there's no separation between us and nature, us and Mother Earth? Could we say there's no separation between my backyard tree and myself? So I mean, it's interesting. So I think, but on a cultural component, whether it's Myanmar or Laos or Thailand, it's very much part of it. So maybe that's why I also felt at home. There was a connection to that, relate to all relations and how that cultural component. And we know that the Dharma can adapt as it went through the Silk Road, adapt through many cultures and changed. And then we go into other schools, Mahayana, Vajrayana, different aspects, and so which I think would touch more on that, than the Theravada. Yeah, so that's all I have to say about that. And I one of my favorite teachers, our late beloved teacher who's Mahayana, but I appreciate, and I've been in the company of his teachings, and his teachings was immediately connected to community, which was the very late Thich Nhat Hanh, and he immediately put us all in circles. We were in a grove of many different circles of touching in with community. And so his inner beingness could be an example of also that there is a connection. So, yeah.
In my own kind of exploration of this question, I was really puzzled about why there are so few representations in Mahayana and Vajrayana art of the earth goddess at the moment of the Buddha calling her to witness. And it led me to discover that actually in Thailand and in a number of other, in Myanmar and in Cambodia and in Laos, there is a much richer tradition of representing as a full person wringing her hair out the earth goddess, which you see everywhere in Thailand. So I think that cultures where there is a resonance with elements of the teachings because of how the indigenous presence or that particular valuing of the earth or of sacred feminine is there, it does link in with Buddhist teachings in a very vivid way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And what's interesting is, I took an art class in college many long time ago with this amazing art teacher. And she would take people to India and places to go to Buddhist pilgrimages. And I wrote a paper on the Yakshi. And so, which is like these deities that are just outside of all the temples. It doesn't matter if it's jade or what temples it is. And what was amazing about it was that in the historical component that she brought in, that people weren't really convinced of religion yet, all over. Like they were following the goddess, they were following the earth base, practices, the more indigenous, rooted goddess of practice. So it was very much affiliated that a woman was involved with this very quick, sacred way to spirituality, to devotion. And so she had, I remember it changed my world. She's like, and they had to develop putting temples, the goddesses, these yakshis or deities there to lure people in because they wouldn't go in at first. They look at these buildings and they see these men or these priests or these sadhus or something. They're just like, what? Like, I don't, yeah, no. So they had to it was art that helped the Buddha really go through even a bigger way, but it was also because of the female body and the representation of the female goddess that there is a familiarity for people that they started trusting to come into the temples. I thought that was interesting.
Absolutely. You mentioned community, and I think just as a last question, so you mentioned being in circle and how the late Thich Nhat Hanh would bring people into community and value and uplift community. Can you talk about community as part of healing, as part of spiritual awakening, and not just community with other humans, but community with all species?
Yeah, yes. And thank you for bringing that one in because I was going to touch on that. I think that where we are now in this poly crisis, and this what one of my friends would say, this human supremacy, and that is happening right now is that separation, separation from nature, from all beings, seen and unseen, and separation to self or others. And, so this is where we're at right now in the world, what we're seeing right now. And so for me, like just thinking how, from the indigenous worldview, we're not separate from any of it. We're in relation to all of it. It is my relative. The air is my relative. The breath I breathe, the water that I drink, the water that and it's interesting because even science is backing this up. So you have a Japanese scientist from Japan who had done lots of research on water molecules. When you put something negative and you say you have a glass of water, he put the name of the jar happy, and he just had someone talk happiness to the water. And then he took high level pictures of the crystals. And there were like these amazing mandalas. Then he had someone just go to the next jar and put anger. And they started like getting, angry to the water. And then he took these high level pictures and you saw like something completely different, not something beautiful, something in complete like fear, and it was very interesting seeing the water molecules because from an indigenous point of view, water is living and it has consciousness. And so therefore it is an ally. So, how we drink our water or the intention of it is very important. So there's a relationship there for my very survival and, for all beings, seen and unseen. So, so we've gotten away from that. So how do we come back into understanding that we don't do this alone? One of the practices that I do collectively that I find is very important is making the invisible visible. And we start with self. So there's an action of immediately transparency, authenticity, and vulnerability. Saying something we wouldn't know. We could be in a meeting together for an hour and we wouldn't know that maybe on your way here, someone you love just passed away. We wouldn't know that. So we start practicing to know what is here, that's invisible. Name something invisible that's here. And so by doing that, then we start to widen it out, like who or what is invisible. So the practice goes out. That supports your life today. That means the meal that you received. How many are invisible that made that meal come to you? So there's a widening of this bigger thing that nothing one does is themselves only. That there is an interdependent to all things, whether it's a plant or, that ends up as a salad, it's like, whether it's, whatever it is that none of it, we are not doing this alone at all. And so how do we begin to connect ourselves with the understanding that we are supported through so much and a greater sense of a community, seen and unseen? So I come from the school of thought where Larry Yang, one of my friends and teachers, Awakening Together, his book of like, and even Thich Nhat Hanh said this before he lives, that the next Buddha will be the Sangha, will be the community. So where are we reckoning with? So is the next Buddha the community? And are we inclusive of all in this community? And, and then just really realizing, and one of the things that I feel is very important in the first foundation of mindfulness is the prescription that the Buddha gave is so vital of that first one of like mindfulness of the body and really understanding your breath and the life that it's connected to all things in life in yourself, every cell, every aspect of your body. And then just, going out to the elements as well, understanding how the elements are playing and interplaying in your life, inner and outer. And going from that to even like the 32 body parts. Like, I recently was in a month long and I wanted to do the 32 body parts the whole month long. I was ill for a couple of years and I wanted to come. It was like I was feeling my strongest. So it's like, okay, I want to be with the 32 body parts for this, month because they've helped me through so much. And so, of course, there's the mantra of the 5 groups that you're doing and connecting with these body parts. And it really started to open up as I started getting stiller and stiller, quieter and quieter. And one of the teachers that was working with me in my interview says, why don't you add metta? The moment I add metta, and I was doing a group where there was blood. So I was honoring blood, and then I was sending metta to my blood. In that moment, I got images of being a young girl who started her menses. And blood started to show me my whole life since then with this one thing, period. And I started to, tears were coming down because I had a very tough, monthly period. And I was connecting like, oh my God, blood. It just was, I was remembering, it was sharing the story of my process with blood and purifying, releasing the blood and how it helped sustain where I wasn't feeling, so I was having these images all the way to now I'm menopause. I was floored. I just cried the whole time. This whole journey from 13 to menopause, like, holy cow, no one gave my mom a book about what that would look like or what it would be. But blood sure was there the whole time. And I felt the metta, not just sending metta to blood, but just in remembering all of that and metta to myself as a woman, as a young girl, not knowing, scared, with this bleeding, just the whole memory of all of it. And then just coming into what that meant as a woman. There was so much shame with being on your period. Like, if you bleed heavily and you're in school, like, am I going to bleed through my stuff? And it just, all of it flooded back. It was amazing what the body revealed. And I just was literally in tears and sent metta to my younger self. And as it developed through those stages to now accepting I'm in menopause and I'm aging. And what does that mean culturally? For many cultures, a woman in menopause is forgotten, no longer valued, put away. If we're in America, put away. Anyway, a lot comes up with that. And so I think the practice can hold, profoundly us when we connect to the unseen that's been supporting us the whole way through. That we're not separate, that we're a part of, that has its own intelligence. And I think that I'll lastly say that in indigenous perspective, we don't just have the mental intelligence. There's a global understanding of indigenous people, although we're not monolithic, that understand there are 4 rivers of intelligence moving through us: mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And there's this acknowledgement of these rivers constantly. They're alive, they're moving through. And if you were to practice, I do a meditation on the 4 rivers. If you were to start tracking and assessing, you will notice that those 4 rivers may not be congruent. You would notice where you're lacking attentiveness on one area. And you would touch parts of yourself that you can't even imagine that are so multidimensional beyond this body, beyond this gender, beyond this identification, that's held by something so magnificent, and that we can touch on that. And so I feel like, yeah, I just feel it's, there's so much that is working that can give us the resiliency to be where we are today. And if we do it together, wow, this is what is where we are at right now. I feel very strongly that we need not only my community, but I've invited people to go beyond their community, widen their community to other communities, start supporting each other differently right now, because we all need each other for what's happening in this world in this moment.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.